Okay, good evening, everybody. It's such a bracha, it's a blessing to be with all of you this evening. It's a blessing to welcome people who are online with us as well, who are joining us for this what for me is an anticipated conversation with one of the great thinkers of our generation. And so I'm really honored to be welcoming you here. My name is David Ingber, and I'm the Senior Director of the Bronfman Center here and Jewish Life at the 92nd Street Y. And it's an honor to be sitting together with with my colleague Arna Popko-Fisher and also with Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg. Just by way of introduction, Rabbi Greenberg serves as the president of J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life and as senior scholar in residence at Hadar. Rabbi Greenberg was ordained by Beth Joseph Rabbinical Seminary of Brooklyn, New York, and has a PhD in history from Harvard University. He has had a long and notable career serving the Jewish people. He served in the rabbinate at the Riverdale Jewish Center in the 1960s and served as professor and chairman of the Department of Jewish Studies at City College of the City University of New York in the 1970s. Together with Elie Wiesel, whose name is so prominently featured here in our institution at 92NY, he founded Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and served as its president until 1997. Klal offered pluralistic Jewish learning for Jewish communal leadership and programs of intrafaith dialogue for rabbis of every denominational background from 1997 to 2008. He served as the founding president of the Jewish Life Network, Steinhardt Foundation, which created such programs as Birthright Israel and the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education. Rabbi Greenberg was one of the activist founders of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry and the movement to liberate Russian Jewry. He was a pioneer in the development of Holocaust education and commemoration. When Elie Wiesel served as the chairman of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, Rabbi Greenberg served as its executive director. The commission recommended and drew the blueprint for the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the National Mall in Washington. He served as the museum's chairman from 2000 to 2002. And he is a leading Jewish thinker and has written extensively on post-Holocaust Jewish religious thought, Jewish-Christian relations, pluralism, and the ethics of Jewish power. In his book, Interpreters of Judaism in the Late 20th Century, the Professor Stephen Katz wrote, "No Jewish thinker has had as a great impact on the American Jewish community in the last 2 decades than Irving Yitz Greenberg." And we're here tonight to honor this triumph, not only of life, but also of this magnificent, this comprehensive overview of your rich thought. And so it's such an honor to welcome you, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, to the 92nd Street Y. Joined with our colleague, Arna Popko-Fisher, who serves as the faculty for the Wexner Heritage Foundation and the Wexner Graduate Fellows Program, and has taught at the University of Toronto and McGill University. You, Arna, are currently on the Department of Jewish Studies, faculty at the University of Cincinnati, where you teach Bible and law. But specifically, you wrote to me that the context for your presence here, besides your erudition and your knowledge of Jewish thought very broadly, right, that's not in the text, and your incredible sense of humor, but that you were on the faculty of the J.J. Greenberg Institute's Rabbinic and Educators Institute, which brought together leading educators and rabbis to study with Rabbi Yitz and to try to master his theology. And so it's great to have your voice in this conversation tonight. So thank you to the both of you and to everyone here. I want to begin the conversation tonight with you, Rabbi Yitz, with a really basic question before we move into the heart of the Triumph of Life, this remarkable work. What is theology for your average person? What is theology, and why does it matter? Why should we care about theology?
That's a good question. I quit. No. If I was pushed to the wall, I would say theology really is the search for meaning. And human beings have many needs, material, intellectual, spiritual, but I think certainly one of the critical needs is meaning itself. And there's a complication in our lifetime, my lifetime, your lifetime. First of all, we're living in a culture in which there are serious and even influential movements of thought that claim there is no meaning. So in a sense, it becomes, I think, valuable and important to offer the alternative, that there are, in fact, interpretive approaches to life that do argue for meaning. Secondly, and this is, for me, is what's driven me most of my life too, it's also the time we live in a different sense. I think Jewish people have lived through, in the past, in my lifetime really, in my lifetime, have lived through the most momentous and challenging century of our whole history. Sometimes I say it very simply, if you think about it. The greatest event of redemption and of liberation and of purpose and higher calling in the Jewish tradition is the Exodus from Egypt. The greatest destruction until the 20th century, the greatest destruction and challenge to belief and to purpose and to values of the Jewish people was the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile that followed 2,000 years ago. We're living in a century in which an exodus greater than the biblical exodus. I could defend that, but I'll say on one foot. The exodus of the creation of the state of Israel is greater than the biblical exodus by every measure. 600,000 Jews went out of Egypt, says the Torah. 600,000 Jews were in the Yishuv when it defended itself against the invading Arab armies and saved its own existence. But after the 600,000 survived, 800,000 Arab Jews were evacuated or expelled and came to the land of Israel for new life. Between 1.5 million Russian Jews came in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed, and about 500,000 came from 1970 when it began to open up until the 1990s. 150,000 Ethiopian Jews, one could go on and on. So by sheer numbers, not to mention the contrast, the shift from slavery in Egypt to freedom in Israel, compare that to the shift from the utter degradation, human life, Jewish life without value in Auschwitz, and the heights of Jerusalem reborn and renewed. So I start by saying we're living in an age in which the liberation is greater than ever before, the destruction is ever before, but they occur almost simultaneously. So if the Exodus led to the Bible and the great Jewish impact on the whole world of teaching of ethical monotheism in God, and if the destruction of the temple led to the Talmud, which is the second most important sacred text of the Jewish people, what should happen or what should follow in an age where you have both these together and multiplied? And so part of the answer is, I was looking around, I'd like to see the text, the creativity, the state itself, which is an amazing creation, is worthy of this period. But that's what I think theology is, to try to make sense of living in such an age, to try to make sense of the question of, does such a great, dazzling creation prove God? Does it prove the Jewish mission to bring the world to a final redemption? Does the Holocaust disprove most of our beliefs? So for me, theology was a kind of an existential response to the sights and experiences that I was living through. And I think, of course, everything I've said, it is compounded by the year after October 7th, when we suddenly realized that everything I was saying is up for grabs, and that important parts of this world don't accept the notion that we have a right to live by right and exist as a state by right. So that's what drove me, among other reasons, all my life to write books, but in particular to write this book.
So I just want to thank you for that answer. And so to underscore the importance of theology, the importance of meaning making, and storytelling, narrative theology, or telling a narrative or a story about the world that helps us make meaning is the theological impetus. So I want to begin to explore your oeuvre, your theology, Rabbi Yitz, which is quite profound. And one of the things that that is so profound for those who know your work or who will read this work for the first time is how you will dance between the particularism of the Jewish story and our understanding of God and understanding of history, and also the universal implications of it, how it speaks to humanity as a whole and the dignity of all human beings. So I'd love for you to begin unpacking your theology, and then I would like, Arna, you can just jump in at any moment here in this conversation, but I would love for you to, Rabbi Yitz, to start walking us through the triumph of life. When I was reading it, I was thinking of Moshe Rabbeinu in the book of Deuteronomy, in how Moshe was trying to tell the Jewish people, like, to remember these important teachings that Moshe had given us. And I felt that you were also very powerfully trying to remind all of us about the emphases that you placed on the dignity of human life, and also, most importantly, maybe tikkun olam, and how there is the possibility of bringing about a world that is more compassionate, more loving, more infused with justice. So maybe talk to us about tikkun olam and about the triumph of life and covenantal responsibility, or anything you'd like to say, Rabbi Yitz, honestly.
Well, again, let me just start by saying that, of course, that is the great Jewish impact on world civilization. We're not, Jews are less than 0.02%, 0.2% of the world population, but there's no question that we have had an impact, as great as any major. I sometimes say the Chinese had a great impact, but they have 1 billion Chinese. We have 14 million Jews barely. So pound for pound, we are the most impactful, influential people of all time. But what was the influence? And I come back to, behind Judaism is a vision and a dream. The vision is, you don't accept this world as it is. I actually should have gone the first step in the dream, and has had the latest impact, because one point, which is that this is not an accidental planet. This is not a random rock on some minor planetary system, on a minor star in a galaxy off to the side of the Milky Way. What the Torah claims is that this planet is a creation. That is to say, it is shaped like a work of art. It's not random and accidental. If you look at its detail, if you look at its finest points, you will see that it has structures and meaning, and more important from the Torah's point of view, it claims that behind this creation is a creator. And that, as I say, is the most famous Jewish contribution to world civilization. The idea of God and the universal creator. But my book is really focused on the second most influential Jewish idea in the world, and that is, of course, the dream behind Judaism. Don't accept the world as it is. The status quo is full of a lot of problems, a lot of suffering, a lot of rottenness, a lot of injustice, a lot of poverty, a lot of hunger. What the Jewish tradition said is the ultimate vision of the Creator is that this world can be turned into a paradise in which all life, and certainly human life, the most developed form of life, will live in full dignity. In the book, I have a whole chapter, what's the definition of full dignity of human life? And
Can you unpack that, the three basic features?
So based on the Talmudic explanation, I try to argue that it means being in the image of God. That's what the Torah says. Every human being is in the image of God. Come back to that moment. What does it mean? I thought we weren't allowed to have images of God, but my argument is based on this Talmudic teaching. That means that every human being, by dint of being an image of God, and I mean every human being, because the Torah starts not with the first Jew, but with the first moment of existence, and eventually goes down to life, and eventually after that life to human life, the most developed form of life. So the Torah describes this life not as a Jew, but as a form of life. So I start with the fact that the Torah says that every human being, male and female, no matter what the background and difference, is image of God. And what does image of God mean? That you're born with three inalienable dignities. I used to have this fantasy. I was an American historian in my original incarnation. And I had this fantasy that I would succeed in getting this out. So I had this fantasy that I would succeed in making this a kind of a cliche that everybody in America recognize. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created in the image of God, and they are endowed by their Creator with three inalienable dignities: infinite value. Human life is infinitely valuable, worth more than any amount of money you could imagine. Equality. There is no preferred image of God. All images of God are legitimate as long as you don't claim that one is the image or a correct image. And uniqueness. You, I, Arna, Rabbi Ingber, all of us are unique. There will never be another person like us. There never has been. And that's the claim of the Torah. When you approach me or you or anybody else, approach this as a person of infinite value, worth more than Elon Musk, worth more than you name it. On the one hand, equal to you and unique, and that's how you should see them, that's how you should treat them, that's how you should look at them. So the Torah's vision is that we will transform this world so that it literally treats every human being with these three dignities. That means we will not have systemic racism against blacks. We will not have systemic sexism that puts down women or women candidates for president. We will have a world in which there is not the kind of hunger, or maybe give the better example, where in Africa, 500,000 children died last year of malaria, who could have been saved if one made mosquito netting. That cost, by the way, it cost $8, and it lasts for 5 years, $1.60 a year. So in Africa, 500,000 children died because nobody put up a half a penny a day to give them mosquito netting last year. So anyway, Judaism says you don't accept this. And Tikkun Olam, is my claim in the book, is a reflection of Jewish messianism that says we will overcome all the enemies of life if we, and we'll talk about who we is later, apply ourselves. So the Jewish dream and vision is that someday we will correct this world so that every child will not die for half a penny's worth of care, so that we will have a world in which everybody is treated as infinitely valuable, equal, and unique, justice for all, equal treatment for all. To bring us to that world is what the Jewish religion is all about. That's my argument. That's why I call it Tikkun Olam. What is distinctive in my claim is that I'm saying that Jewish messianism is not a spiritual phenomenon. It's not to be seen as something that it's only interested in Jews, but rather it's to be visited and seen as a philosophy, a vision for the whole world. All of humanity will someday be redeemed.
Rabbi Ingber and I were talking about the challenge of presenting this work within an hour's time, and the ways in which we might enter the conversation. So first I want to pause for a moment, and at the risk of stating the obvious, to wish you Mazal Tov and Blue, who is here, on the completion of your life's work. That's what's contained here. And for those of us that have had the privilege of studying with Rav Yitz and observing with such, our eyes filled with such adoration and disbelief in your intellect, but also who you are as a human being. I know that Blue's extraordinary wife, who is here, Dr. Greenberg, can attest to the angst that you experienced producing this work, its many, many iterations, the edits that you did over time, even over decades, and maybe one shortcut to kind of get to the essence of this extraordinary piece of theology is to ask you to, if you're comfortable, letting us take a glimpse of what were the pieces of this work that kept you up at night, that caused you to rewrite it, that had a maybe even a radical evolution of thought between 20 years ago and when this was published 6 months ago. And just one more thing, I hope that at one point you would publish all the different versions, right, that preceded this. But what about this work was the most challenging, and what for you went through the greatest number of iterations?
It's not just the work, to be honest. It was, of course, the issues behind the work that I've struggled with all my life. One very simple example. I grew up, was educated in a modern Orthodox home. I was a very fulfilled, happy, still love the Jewish observance, Jewish life, Jewish learning. And was very comfortable with my religious life and my self-understanding as an Orthodox Jew. In 1961, in fact, the truth is I was an academic professor of American history. I was very comfortable and very fulfilled and looking forward to being a professor of intellectual history. In 1961, I had a Fulbright to visit and teach American intellectual history at Tel Aviv University, and stumbled into the Shoah. Again, I stumbled. I had some vague idea about it, and I had certain experiences of exposure through my parents, but I really didn't understand it. And of course, it took over my life. I was totally shattered by it. I mean, again, for someone who had this really strong conviction, I went to a European refugee yeshiva after the war, and so I was very inspired. You felt God's hand. You felt almost everything you did in life was commanded or urged or guided by God and so on. And suddenly you run into this reality of mass murder, torture, suffering, and seemingly no help, no intervention, no fulfillment from God. It was just quite devastating. And of course, the more I read, the worse it got. And so again, when you say what happened, so the truth is I couldn't make sense of it. In fact, since I was an observant and very obedient Jew, I prayed. I wanted to continue praying. I did put on my tefillin every morning. And then the day before, I was reading about Treblinka. And one of the scenes was that it said the guard, when they came through, of course the people came through. Treblinka was a pure murdering camp. Unlike Auschwitz, no one was survived. They put them through and they killed them. And no workers. Anyway, so to make a long story short, as Rachel Auerbach described, she's a survivor of Auschwitz, very few survivors. She says they would come through and the guards would push them through, and of course it was cold in the wintertime. People were freezing and standing in line for hours till they would put to death. So when the children came through, she said, so when the guards sort of had pity on the child, they would sometimes simply smash them over the head, put them out of their misery. But most of the time they didn't. They just pushed them forward. And since there was no room in the gas chambers, there were many times when they would simply push the children directly into the burning pits. So I put on my tefillin, and I just couldn't say the words. I just choked. So again, so the truth is it's now 60 years since that time, and I still don't have an understanding. And there are days still when I feel, when you feel those children, you don't feel any presence of God in the world. On the other hand, I was living in Jerusalem. My wife and I and our first baby boy was born. And that was also a stunning experience. I would come out of Yad Vashem after 8 hours and suddenly it was freezing, chilled to the bone, and I'd walk outside and suddenly there was the sunlight. And there were the streets of Jerusalem. They were bustling with life. And little children were running around, laughing and playing and skipping. So the truth is, for the first 20 years, I lived sort of suspended between the absolute conviction there's no God and there's no meaning and there's no life, and that the Jewish dream of life winning out is a farce, or it's an illusion, it's a dangerous illusion. And then the other half was, the covenant is alive, Israel is reborn, the prophets promised that the streets of Jerusalem will ring with the sound of bride and groom. And here was living proof, and I knew it. And my little Moshe, and I come home to Blue, and my little Moshe was crawling and laughing and gurgling, and I sort of realized life is stronger than death. So it was, anyway, so the truth is I went through 3 phases. The first phase, I simply was a split personality between the two. And I tried to be honest to the two, that there's strong evidence on both sides of this equation. The next 20 years, the next 10 years, I tried to come up with this idea, and probably injected in part by Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel once said, when God gave us a mission, that was fair, and I'm willing to undertake it, he said, but it wasn't fair. He didn't give us full disclosure that it was a suicide mission. And so the truth is, in wrestling with that idea, I came up with the idea that, so if this is true, then the Jews are absolved. God has not lived up to this covenant, not protected us, not saved us. And I came up with the idea, so how come all the Jews around me are keeping the covenant? How come we're having one of the great rebirth periods? People are learning Torah, people are building new lives, people are building the state of Israel. So I came up with this idea, well, the answer is the covenant is functioning because the Jews love the covenant. They love God, they love the covenant, love humanity, and they want to make this world happen no matter what. On the other hand, God is in no position to command. I mean, what kind of monster can command people to go on a suicide mission? If you're a decent human being, you're a decent God, you can ask people to volunteer, but to tell them you must go, suicide, crazy. Make a long story short, in this middle period, I came up with the idea that it's a voluntary covenant. The reason we're keeping it is that God is in no position to order. God can say, please. God can say, help me, I need partnership. That's why I entered a covenant. Help me fix the world. But to command, impossible. So why are the Jews doing it? Because they're amazing volunteers, because they're great people. It didn't go so well. First of all, it wasn't very well accepted. And even the people who I loved and trusted, who I felt were not trying to undermine my religious credibility, told me they thought that it's not a great solution because in the end they were afraid that people voluntarily loses authority, loses its power of tradition and of making a claim upon us. Make a long story short, that started a process which is in this book in a primary way. Number one, a reaction to the death and immersion of Holocaust, a realization that I have to look for the life-affirming qualities of the religion. In this book, I argue that's the main purpose of the religion, is to embrace and affirm life. I began to look for that. Secondly, in response to that, I began to look for, explain, not because God failed, because I came to see that God was in the Holocaust. God was with the Jewish people. In the words of Isaiah, whenever the Jewish people is suffering, God is suffering with them. So I came to see God was in the gas chambers. God was in the ghetto. So God was not guilty of failure in that way. But rather, what I came to see is that God was suffering as God was sharing in the joy, God was sharing the suffering, and that therefore, in a sense, as a partner, God had long ago said, I have stopped the control that I once showed in the biblical period, and it's up to human beings to behave. I will do all my miracles through human beings. I'll do all my miracles through natural law. I really want you. So I came to see that the covenant itself was not a question of voluntary. It was trying to raise people to become autonomous, responsible, willing partners. So, make a long story short, that's what this book reflects, is that movement, which is still not finished. And there are some days when I still am pretty disappointed and angry that God didn't go back to the good old days and save us. But nevertheless, what the book tries to say is I really do believe that the Jewish mission is true, that there is a purpose to redeem and perfect the world, and that we have a partner who accompanies us, who holds us, who judges us, who holds us accountable, who tells us our worth when the world tells us you're nothing, but a partner who in the end says you have to do your share.
So for you, Rabbi Yitz, the focus on covenant and relationship is so essential. I don't know. I remember first hearing that the covenant was a voluntary covenant, and I remember as an Orthodox kid feeling that I was off the hook a little bit. And I wonder, in a world, do you believe that your theology, and I want you to also unpack, because, some of the titles of the parts of the book that, relationship and choice in the covenant, repairing the covenantal method of repairing the world, which you were speaking to, right? Which is, maybe you can unpack that a little bit more of how the covenantal model works in repairing the world. Is it partnership? I just want to hear more about it, but I'm just wondering, if you're not the way we are. I grew up also in a modern Orthodox milieu, and then was deeply influenced by Orthodox thinkers. If one begins with the assumption that humanity constructs religion and isn't given in some heteronomous way that God decided for us, right? Is your chiddush a chiddush in the world outside of the Orthodox world? I guess I want to know from your perspective. Is it speaking to those who already begin from the assumption of heteronomy and now moving towards autonomy and more covenantal partnership? What do you answer to that? And
Well, again, first of all, I want to say I'm still very proud and identified with the Orthodox community in terms of my life and my behavior patterns and my community living. Having said that, since the exposure to the Holocaust, I long ago concluded that all Jews carry the message, not just Orthodox Jews, that what the Jews stood for, and again, this is worth thinking about, and I welcome your reactions too, at least in part, it's because I think Hitler and the Nazis hated the Jews because their statement of God really is another way of saying that only God is absolute. What Nazism was about was the Führer is absolute, that human make the absolute rules. They decide who shall live, who shall die. They decide what's right and what's wrong. So the Jewish claim that there is a God is another way of saying that Hitler is not God, that Nazism is not absolute. And any system that thinks of itself as absolute ends up hating the Jews or fighting them because they're a threat. So I start with that. I think that was a major consideration here in terms of covenant, why Jews were so persecuted. Now, from my perspective, this is my argument, that the Jewish witness that there is a God is in itself an important contribution, particularly in a world we're living in now where God is, I think by choice, but in any event by design, invisible and not showing audiovisual signs like splitting Red Seas or other kinds of miracles, voices from heaven. Given that truth, I think our witness is extremely important. And again, we can only say witness, we can only point, we can only hint, we can't show audiovisual anymore, I think by God's will. So number one, I think our statement of covenants, why is it so important? Because many other people than us have come to accept the idea of God. There are 1.9 billion Christians and 1.1 billion Islamists, plus other religions. But many people, when they turn to God who becomes the big daddy who takes over, does everything, as the Haredim and even Orthodox Jews did 200 years ago when Zionism started. They said, no, you have to wait to God to send a messianic redeemer who will do it all for us. So the danger of believing in God is that you become a kind of independent and leave the major decisions and major redemptions to God. That's the danger on one side. The danger on the other side, which we've seen in modern culture, is when God does not show the obvious kinds of things, when God gives us great autonomy and freedom. Some people say, look, I did it all by autonomy, freedom. I did it all myself. I'm God. I'm the master of the universe. And we see what that has led to. Led to totalitarianism. It's led to climate destruction in the name of building prosperity. It's led to species destruction. In short, the world without God has serious dangers, and a world with God has serious handicaps and dangers. What the Jewish tradition offered was, I think, the most meaningful resolution of this. You have the God who tells the truth and who tells the standard of morality even when the whole world denies it. You have the God who says that I love you and you are valuable, and never mind that they call you inferior because you're Jewish or because you're black or because you're a woman. We have the God who shares and stands with us, and I'm not afraid when I walk in the valley of shadow of death. Not that God will protect me from bullets, but will be with me and I won't not alone. So that is the moment. I think the covenant is the kind of the sweet spot. And the Jewish tradition said that that's where you are as a human being, not abandoned, not in an empty world. You're in a world where if you look deeply and if you turn deeply into life, you will discover you have a partner, you have a purpose, you have a goal, a very inspiring, noble goal. And if you're willing to stick your neck out, if you're willing to devote your life, if you're willing to work hard at it, you can make a major difference in the world as we live in.
So can I just ask one quick question, and then I know that Arna wants to also ask you a question, Rabbi Yitz. So would you say, and you know, in reading your book, I kept asking myself this question: is this theology a theology for the Jews, or in other words, is Jewish theology for Jews, for you to unpack for Jews what the beauty of their own tradition is saying, implicate in an implied way or an explicit way in the text, saying, hey, did you know that our tradition tries to find the balance between a God who robs us of agency versus a God who gives us, demands of us to be completely agentic, and the world is about humans, try to find the middle place? Or is it, this is a model of correct belief, as it were, like would that every believer in every tradition would have this correct belief in the healthy balance between the divine and human agency, and it's kind of a model of this. Because often when Jews think of covenant, at least Jews who grew up like I did, we think of covenant as exclusive. Right. Like, hey, we have an intimate relationship with you, God, and it's very different than everybody else. But is your theology a theology that says, this is a Jewish contribution to the conversation about a healthy relationship with God as the ultimate power, and that ideally everybody would have a kind of healthy balance between these two, whether they were Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever it is?
Well, thank you for saying that. I really do welcome that comment. I think it's very crucial. I believe this is a model. I think, again, every religion I know grew up in a world in which they were the only exclusive source of the values and information of their own believers. So it was easy to say, well, we're great and the others are nothing. Or in the case of the Jewish people, we're the ones chosen by God and everybody else is a guy. Everybody else is out there sort of all alone with not much to. What I've come to see, and when I met these people in flesh and exposed to them and their religion, their values through the culture, I came to realize there's a tremendous amount of religious power, the divine presence, even in religions that don't believe in God in the same personal way we do. So I think what I'm offering is a model, but I do believe that particular model is applicable for other religions. Furthermore, I feel that very strongly. God doesn't work through one people. Or as I put it, the best way I ever felt I ever put it was, I believe God chooses. And I understand that's what I'm teaching my religion, and we're a chosen people. But I just want to point out that God practices multiple choice. And that I've come to believe, I feel that very strongly. I came to believe, particularly in terms of Christianity, which is direct outgrowth of Judaism, I really came to feel that God encouraged, wanted, welcomed the fact that it's developed its own parallel and separated off, making room for both partners. In my judgment, they should have been partners, to show this model. But I also believe that there are other models and other possibilities. And yes, each religion, now again, they have to shape up. Look, Islam, which in the Middle Ages the Jews treated as even a higher degree of respect than Christianity, is really, Maimonides treats it like a valid world religion. Not perfect, and Judaism, and eventually they'll realize this is the real best one. But still, he treats it as great. But Islam, again, it has to choose that side of itself. We're living in a century where Islam has become dominated, or certainly influenced, by the most negative versions of Islam, by jihad and by the right to murder anybody who doesn't fit your definition of Islam. So my answer is, I believe God wants to work through has the ability, each community has that ability, but in order to do so, it has to choose life, it has to pick its own teachings that make human responsibility and a better world as against the right to wipe out those who disagree with you or the right to, by violence, force people to live the right religion. So that is part of, again, that's part of the conversation. I think, anyway, I'll start with that. So covenant is, my mind, is a model, but I'd like to see other religions either apply covenant or alternate models to the same goal.
I'm going to engage Rabbi Ingber in conversation just for a moment, in part to remind you, though, so there's water here. It's hard for me to resist asking you to respond, or even for you to confess that there was a little bit of confessional going on when you asked Rav Yitz about his notion of heteronomy versus autonomy, and you asked to use the word chiddush. In other words, you were questioning, is it possible, and correct me if far be it from me to correct you, Rabbi Ingber, so you'll let me know. We have a friendly collegial competition. It seems to me that you are asking, is it possible to have the kind of rigor of theology present in a movement that does not believe in the kind of imposing heteronomy of law or God, and therefore allow for that wonderfully surprising dynamic of the covenantal relationship being voluntary? So,
or as I'm saying now, free, even though God is speaking, it's a free response. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, so, I guess I'm interested in both of your responses. Can there be that kind of rigor in a non-heteronomic system?
I think my question was a bit simpler, which is, Rabbi Yitz begins with, I think, in all theology, not all, but theology often begins with a prioris, with assumptions that you work with. And then once those assumptions are in place, one then, in order for there to be coherence, you have to work around or within those assumptions. So if you're someone who begins with the assumption that God gave the Torah, and the Torah, it looks a particular way, and you're reading the Torah just simply, then you have to explain all manner of phenomena against that pre-given right structure. And so within that, I think it's remarkably unique the way that Rabbi Yitz worked with those assumptions, and why, for many thinkers, you went a bit beyond what they thought the givens allowed. And you did it with great courage and quite boldly. And it's deeply Jewish and deeply rooted in, I would say, a traditionalist. It's kind of a breach against a traditionalist perspective, or pushing the traditionalism beyond where it originally was. One could begin from a different place, right? If you began with different assumptions, right, meaning around the authority of the text and how the text was constructed and its source of authority, you might not have to work within those classic assumptions. You might not, for example, in Rabbi Yitz's theology, the world of miracles gives way. That's the first world, and we're working towards a world where miracles are not explicit but implied, right, in your third.
The miracle is the laws rather than the
supernatural.
Supernatural.
Which is even a greater, for you, that's an even greater expression of divine immanence. God is in all things and moving through us in the laws of nature and in human hands. And am I correct in that way? Right. So maybe a different theology might not begin with the assumption that the miracles took place and that there was a shift, right? They might not be working within that. They might say it was always the case that there are overt miracles and there are hidden miracles and there is no trajectory. But yes, I think, I'm not struggling with it. I think that it's rigorous and it's just a different beginning.
Well, to be fair to Rabbi Ingber, who's too polite to say it, I'll say it a little sharper. Implicit in the question is a legitimate one, which is this original because it's an Orthodox background? But this is something that Reform has taken for granted, or secular Jews have taken for granted for 50 or 100 years already. It's like sometimes people say to me, we admire you and your wife in particular, leadership for women, but let's face it, the rights that she is fighting for were given in the non-Orthodox movements years ago. So, what's the big deal? I mean, maybe the big deal is in the personal biography, yet you're struggling with your community. But what's it mean to people who come from a different background? So it's a fair question, and the honest answer is, again, I come back, particularly since the show, I've tried very hard to write not just for the people who share my background and assumptions, but for people who come from a very wide range of backgrounds. Sometimes people accuse me of trying to, write vaguely enough so that everybody can say he agrees with me, which is a half truth. I mean, sometimes people tell me, because the truth again, because I've come to see, it's one of the insights of contemporary culture, that people do see things very much shaped by where they come from and where they are located right now. But then if God wants to speak, or if the Word of God or theology wants to speak, then it has to allow for the range of places. And some things you say here will not be heard there unless you broaden, soften, nuance, multiply. Sometimes I write things that disagree with what I'm writing. But that's part of trying to come up with something that can be heard over a wider range of people. And again, I'm not trying to simply get my audience. It's because I really feel that the Torah presents that God wants to speak to all of humanity, not just to a small elite. In fact, again, I always talk about this week, why does the Torah start? Where does the Torah start? First moment of the Torah is not, as Rashi points out, the very first Rashi in the Torah. It doesn't start with the first law because the Torah is not presenting as a book of laws. There are many laws in it. It doesn't start with the first Jew because the Torah is not presenting as the book of history and of life meaning for the Jewish tribe. The first Jew shows up in the Genesis chapter 11. So the Torah starts from the first minute of existence, before any human existed, before any life existed. And it goes through to life and to the first human beings and so on. I think because it's trying to say that the guidance, the life values that we're pushing are meant not just for the Jewish people or for this tribe, but for the whole world. And that the whole world can learn from this and the whole world should practice from this, even if they vary it in their own terms. So yeah, that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book. And again, it's not going to work unless a wide range of people read it generously.
So can I ask another difficult question, and then and maybe Arna also, can you weigh in on this, please? So if your average reader might read the book and think, but wait a second, isn't Judaism itself, in its simple reading, an obstacle to some of the very things that you're claiming that it was pushing forth as an agenda into the world? Meaning, in the very same text, the 5 books of Torah, and in the rabbinic tradition, there are so many examples where Judaism itself was participating in the obfuscating of these theological truths. Like so often, right? The 3 basic, infinities that you beautifully point out, that the inalienable rights, the inalienable dignities that we have. Jewish history is replete with the slow and methodical and sometimes completely frustrating journey towards those dignities themselves. I mean, halakha often slavery, and so how do you? Maybe I'll ask. Maybe Arna, do you want to weigh in on this quickly about
I'm just so disappointed you had to go there in the conversation. Yeah. I'm going to stay quiet.
So I just wondering, how do you respond to those?
So the answer again is that's another truth, very important truth. Every tradition has a tremendous range of views in it, and there are, in fact, much more influential and much more important thinkers and rabbis have taken other aspects of tradition and said that's what's central. So there's no question that what I'm offering is an interpretation, or if you will, pulling together. I don't think I manufactured anything. I think 90% of the strands woven together are in the tradition. In many cases, they're minority or they're part-time statements, not full-time. But that's the task. In other words, come back to what's theology about. I think in the end, my interpretation from the beginning, whether it's prophets or whether it's rabbis or whether it's teachers or whether it's thinkers or whether it's whatever they are, halachas, in the end, what their task is to weave together the pattern of meaning that they think the overall picture is. People ask me, I look back now, I had many great teachers, very lucky in that way. I met Rabbi Soloveitchik when I went to graduate school. I was a rabbi already. I had spent many years studying Talmud. I knew much more than his average student when I met him. So in a way, what did I get from him? And that was the thing. He totally blew my mind because I knew thousands of halachot, but what he made me see is that there's a pattern. If you look, you will see patterns. And of course, when you see patterns, some things stand out and other things you don't see because they don't fit the pattern. So he had this double impact on me, which really I hope is still reflected in the book. One was to look for patterns. And then you're quite right. My understanding of that pattern is a prism, and many other alternative prisms exist. I'm offering it as I'm arguing theology in general. I'm offering it, and let those who come and taste it and make sense to them and it interprets and inspires them, they should use it. And those that don't, I understand. I accept that. The second thing he taught me was it's a world religion. In other words, I think that was the biggest shortcoming of my teachers also. In other words, they were worried about and they were trying to make sense how it operates within the Jewish community, but were almost indifferent, sometimes hostile, to what does this mean to a Gentile, what does this mean to a Christian or a Hindu, because they weren't even interested. Not to mention, so what he tried to get me to see is if you think Judaism is a world religion, you have to treat it like a world religion. You have to see what does it say to all of humanity, not just to your particular version of humanity and so on. So I think that's an unfinished job. I think it's a blessing that we live in a society where you're exposed to every possible viewpoint and way of life as never before. And it's a crisis. It's 200 years old crisis because every religion raised its people by having a shelter and teaching them its version as the best version. Now, can it survive in a world in which its version is one of hundreds and thousands of versions available, and some of them are better presented? So my answer is, that's the test, and that's one of the jobs of theologians, to try to present a version that can stand up in the presence of the others and to make it even sharper. In the good old days, you could put down the others, but now, to the extent that you do, you lose credibility. So it's a paradox. If you really want to be believed, you have to talk nicer about them and push your own greatness less. You're more credible. So this is a fascinating challenge to me. Again, so we'll find out if this kind of thinking can stand in the presence of the other. I'd like to think it can, in part because it takes the other seriously. So the other is more likely to take this seriously.
Speaking of Rabbi Soloveitchik, I know that you're familiar with a lecture that Rabbi Soloveitchik gave, I guess 30 years ago. You know, as we get older, we have no sense of time, context.
Speak for yourself, you're not getting older yet, so go ahead.
And this essay, this lecture was captured in an essay entitled "The Ethics of Suffering," where Rabbi Soloveitchik struggles with and tries to understand how halakha, how Jewish law, the dialectic of it, responds to and doesn't respond to the experience of human suffering. Mm-hmm. And in it somewhere he says, you know, we are so not the tradition of being the opium of the masses, the famous Marx criticism of Judaism. In fact, we want people to walk away perplexed. Judaism is not meant to solve everyone's existential question, but it's there to sort of foment it and work with it. I don't want the evening to go by without mentioning, number one, that on this beautiful book cover is the Natan Prize. It's given to your work. The Natan Foundation, named in honor of the memory of your beloved son, JJ, the JJ Institute that was named in memory of your son. And I know that you and Blue are very cautious and reticent to talk about the pain of that loss in response to any question. But when you write a work entitled The Triumph of Life, that in every page, and as Rabbi Ingber has called from it, breathes optimism, hope, For as long as I've had the privilege of knowing you, Rabbi Greenberg, you more than anyone else sees such joy, such life, bright future in the Jewish framing of everything. I mean, I would say that's your thesis. And those students who have studied with you, especially rabbis today, struggling with how to find that positive, right? What's the positive framing in a world which they overwhelmingly find so difficult, so perplexing, they meet you. And I've heard them say they don't understand they literally cannot comprehend, cannot make sense of this coherent optimism and hope that you have, in spite of experiencing one of life's greatest sorrows. So I feel like I've asked you this question in so many ways, but I never tire of hearing the multitude of ways in which you respond to it. How do you explain your hope and your optimism?
The answer is deranged thyroid syndrome. If you have excessive thyroid hormone, you feel optimistic. It's like being on drugs. Anyway, that's my first.
In a footnote somewhere?
That's my first explanation, probably the correct one. Now, what other explanations can I offer? Well, so part of it again is I have to say I've swallowed the Kool-Aid. In other words, I think Judaism, in the end, has this is its amazing message. And what I love about it is it doesn't hide the suffering, and the Torah doesn't anymore. The Torah speaks about it, human capacity to be noble, but it doesn't hide the fact that some of the greatest Jews had serious handicaps and what Blue always calls, the flawed model, that our heroes are flawed, and that's part of our greatness. We used to, in the early days before I became a dialogician Christian, I would love that comparison. Sort of the Jews, the Christian version is, again, he's a virgin birth. His mother is spotless. Is never, virgin birth means that there was no sex. I mean, this is pure, and he is without flaw, and so on. That's against the Jewish vision of the Messiah, which starts with, the daughters of Lot seducing their father because they think the world is destroyed, and the only way they can keep humanity going is by getting their father drunk and seducing him. So I said, well, this is the comparison. Christianity believes in, immaculate conception and virgin birth, and Jews believe in drunken incest, and this is how we redeem the world. So I come back. The Judaism acknowledges the flaws. It acknowledges the flaws. It really does. But it still has this incredibly optimistic vision. Again, it says it depends on you. It's not going to happen by itself. Well, I should say many Jews along the way said it's going to happen by itself and we should get out of the way. But in the end, I think it's saying, if you will do your share of the partnership, you will get there, but it's already taken thousands of generations, and it's probably going to take a little bit longer. But the second reason why I'm optimistic is that I really think I swallowed the Kool-Aid, and I think, again, generations before me passed it on to me, and as long as I can and you can pass it on to the next generation, I think it's still credible, and it's still a possibility. That's the second reason. The third reason, and again, I certainly don't want to deny suffering and tragedy. It is hard. So, the old joke, you think it's easy to be an optimist. It's hard to be an optimist. But I would go a step beyond it. It's a wound that never heals. But again, you accept the fact that the Torah says, Shirim, the Song of Songs says, love is azar, it's fiercer, it's stronger than death. It's literally fiercer. So what I come to see, number one, is as devastating as death is, that love continues, and feel it in your life even when the person is dead. That's number one. And number two, I will say in the book, I think it's one of the strangest things in the whole book is the claim. I argue triumph of life, that the greatest Jewish message. If you take that seriously, I'll be happy to get your feedback, the two of you, because if you take it really seriously, and in one chapter I start by taking it very seriously, it means what it means. That means that we are going to overcome poverty and hunger and sickness and war, every enemy of life, to the point where eventually we're going to defeat death, literally. So if you think that's pretty hard to believe, at least I start off, let's thought experiment. Let's say that's our goal. That's our goal. And I got a little scared when I read that, because I felt Leon Kass, other great writers have argued that the acceptance of death is what makes us human. And when you start to think of overcoming death, you know, it's trying to escape your humanity, and that's a very dangerous development. Then again, having said that, in struggling with this question, it occurred to me, I came to this Jewish belief. Why do I believe in triumph of life? Well, because the prophets say that, but the ultimate proof that it sticks for that is resurrection. The rabbis insisted, this is the rabbis, because the Torah is very vague about this, that you have to believe in resurrection. Now again, I'm not talking immortality that the soul lives on. That's fairly widespread and easy to believe. What the rabbis insisted we have to believe is, no, the body, someday, that body, the person who died, will be resurrected, and the person, not the spirit, not the beautiful soul, but the flesh and blood person, the one who sometimes smelled, the one who sometimes sweated, the one who sometimes was so sick and so frail, that's what's going to come back. Because the truth is, that's the one I loved. I didn't love some ideal vision of my son any more than I loved an ideal vision of my wife. The flesh and blood human being who gets annoyed with you sometimes, or you get annoyed with them, who irritates, or who is best behavior sometimes brings out your worst response because you're not dreadful enough. So my point is, the passage in that book that I think most reflects the experience of loss is resurrection.
Yeah.
When we sat Shiva for JJ, again, Blue has talked about this too, some very well-meaning people came in and said, you know, God needs him, and called him. And Blue's reaction was, we need him more. You know, and people come, they meant well, they really do. They're trying to say, have the consolation of he's with God and so on and so forth. But I came to realize that now the only consolation I would have, and by the way, I came to this in struggling with the Holocaust before it happened personally. I said, what could make up? In the end, even the state of Israel, it's very inspiring and it's very amazing response of life. It shows the power of life. It shows the Jewish claim that life is stronger than death is true. But having said that, that's no consolation and recommend. The only thing that would be valid to restore the Shoah would be to bring back the 6 million of flesh and blood. So the truth is, in that passage on resurrection, I tried to suggest that the rabbis are trying to tell us that the people we love, and we should appreciate that, are not just souls and spirits. And it's not just that we believe in higher life. It's that we affirm, we embrace, we love, we make love to a flesh and blood human being. The people that are most important in my life. Come back to infinite value, equality, uniqueness.
I know, I was about to do that. I was about to say that in the infinite value, you ask the question, these infinite dignities that we all are imbued with are rooted themselves in an axiomatic experience of God's love. And that God's love is intimate, it's personal, it's all of those things are rooted in that givenness.
Let me stress it this way. I try to ask myself one day, who in my life is infinitely valuable, equal, and unique? Infinitely valuable, I'd give every last penny. I have a lot of good friends, a lot of people. I wouldn't give my last penny. I might give something, but I'm not showing the last penny.
Yeah.
Who in my life is unique and irreplaceable? And I realized one day it's the people I love. Right. Once you love somebody, they're irreplaceable and unique. Well, so then I said, how can every human being in the whole world be infinitely valuable, unique? The answer is, and this is the Torah's answer, because there is a force, a power, a person, a universal person, force that loves every human being. Chaviv Adam, as Rabbi Akiva put it in Pirkei Avot, he said, the human being is beloved because they were created in the image of God, or the proof, is my version of Rabbi Akiva, the proof of their infinite value is that they're loved, and the proof that they're loved is their infinite value. So that's part of the ongoing challenge.
I wanted to, so I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to do this again, and we have until 8:30, so we have about 20 or so minutes in a moment, and I wanted to maybe open up for some questions and some comments from all of you who are here, and again, thank you for being here in a second. I just wanted to take the opportunity to share two things with you, Rabbi Yitz. One is that you forever changed my own religious journey, struggling with the literal and the concrete ways that Chazal, the rabbis, and the liturgy, the prayer book, speak about some things, especially resurrection of the dead. You know, whenever we say Mechayim Eitim, one who brings, life back or resurrects the dead or brings those who have passed back, the inclination was always to make it a bit more abstract, as you said. And then I remember reading what you had said about JJ, and that your hope was to, that when you pray that prayer, you're saying not just that God brings the dead back in spirit, but in the flesh, and that you long to see your son again. So for me personally, that was very spiritually meaningful, and I just wanted to share a Torah around that inspired me this year, especially around Israel, and I shared it with the community here and at Romamu, where in looking at the phrase Od lo avda tikvatenu in Hatikva and hope, that the poet of Hatikva, Ingber, Naftali Tzvi Ingber, was working off of Yecheskel 37, Ezekiel 37, about the resurrection of the dead, about the dry bones, and that when he wrote Odlo of Datik Vatena, that our hope is not lost, he was talking about he was responding to the bones, the dry bones that said Avdatik Vatenu, our hope is lost. And he said Odlo of Datik Vatenu, that Israel, as you said, is yet another instantiation, if not literally, hopefully one day literally, but like a resurrection of those very dry bones. And that I thought about the shofar that we blow into each and every Rosh Hashanah, and that it's, in some sense, itself a dry bone. And that every time we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah every year, we remind ourselves of that our hope is to bring the concrete, physical, intimate, smelly, real, mucky, right, resurrection of physical life in all of its, complexity and all of its sharpness and all of its, that's what I was thinking as you were speaking. And I wanted to say the last thing is that the Romo community knows over the last 18 years that on more than one Yom Kippur, I've read from the remarkable Hesped eulogy that you gave for your son, where you said that as a Kohen. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you.
Do you have a reaction?
Yeah, Arna.
My reaction is that you have an extraordinary educator and rabbi over there, the next generation, Rabbi Ingber. For those of you that would love to hear more of that Torah that comes so straight from the heart and the head and has developed a beautiful community, show up on Shabbat to Romamu. But there aren't many people, aren't many rabbis like Rabbi Ingber that bring together all those elements. So you have two beautiful rabbis here. Not so bad.
Awesome. Thank you. So maybe we should take some questions. People were chomping. You could just call them out, and you know what? So the people can.
It's a wonderful pleasure just to be in your presence and to see such a face of happiness and warmth and love. And I'm really just happy to be here. But I would like to be a fly on the wall at a presentation of your book to another group of people in another theology, anywhere, just to hear how they would react to the idea that the Jewish message is universal and there's something in it for you too. How does that really go over in reality?
Well, if,
I want to get a number of
oh,
questions.
sorry, sure.
Really, your presentation was most stimulating and enlightening. And
Use the mic.
your presentation was most stimulating and enlightening, and I just want to hear more and more from you. I guess I'm curious to know, given your clarity of thinking and the way you would delve into assumptions to go beneath them or around them to understand what's really meant, who are most influential in helping you develop your mind, starting with your family, your rabbis, your teachers, and even your peers? Like when you would write a book such as this, who would you want to look at it and get feedback from?
Do you have any more questions, anybody?
So I very much enjoyed the talk. It was very powerful and from the heart. I wanted to just, before I ask a question, just introduce it with a very short little story. I was walking down Broadway years ago, walking downtown, and it was starting to rain, and there was a black man lying in the street near the gutter. He may have been inebriated, or I don't know what, but a chassid came out of one of the stores along Broadway, a portly chassid, came and schlepped him onto the sidewalk under the shadow of awning, and I was remarkably moved by it because it seemed so incongruous that a chassid would do that. I mean, I haven't seen that in the past. That it's not beyond something they would do. And I was wondering, why is it that in something that troubles me, why is it that in the frum world, that everybody's created image of God doesn't sell all that well? So, it's something that sort of bothers me on a certain level. I wish it were, it had more voltage than it does.
Okay, so 3 questions, and I just wanted to, if I could add a 4th question, just so you know how to apportion the next 15 minutes, Rabbi Yitz. So we had a question about the voltage of the dignity of each and every human being, and anecdotally, why isn't it more popular? Or I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that was your question. And we had these, your early influences and how you would respond, and how your theology would work in a world, in a context where that theology might not, like different contexts. And the last one is, what are you hopeful about right now, given where we are as a Jewish people at this moment, after almost, over a year of war on 7 different fronts? You're living in Israel. You are, as all Israelis, in danger to some extent. All Israelis are living with danger. What are your concerns? It's a big question, and to leave at the end, and maybe I did it on purpose so we could have a little bit less time to unpack all of that. But to the extent that you can touch on that a little bit in the last 15 minutes, I would appreciate it.
Well, let's go to the first question was different audiences. I don't know if that was an indirect hint that in the traditional audience it would not be well received. So again, to me, that's the challenge of communication in the world we live in. What we now know, and that's one of the main accomplishments of this culture, all the voices that were never heard are now heard, are available. Some of those voices are ugly, nasty, vicious, so I'm not trying to glorify it. But given the fact that there's multiple audiences, I'm sure there are audiences that would not accept my words at all. I have this secret hope that since all human beings are image of God, that they recognize when they hear and someone says, you are infinite value, that something in them says, yeah, that's me, I recognize myself. So I'm hoping that this message will in fact be listened to, not just by people who live my way and share my educational and other exact parameters, but a much wider range of people. And so that's my main hope. But in the end, I say that before, you put out the words as best you can, you put out the ideas as best you can understand them. And at this point, the rest depends on how people will hear and understand it, and I'm accepting that. You asked, or was the next person who asked about who influenced me. I will say this is a plug for the book. If you read the opening acknowledgments, I have 3 pages listing many people who had I felt a very profound and important influence on my thinking. The other thing I would add, I do think it's one of my few redeeming features. I'm willing to listen to people, and over my lifetime I've been lucky enough to hear a very wide range of people, including people who criticized and disagreed, and who I could learn from. That's one of the things I came to see about pluralism. It's one of its greatnesses. Pluralism doesn't mean you don't believe in your own tradition, or you don't even see your tradition as having absolute values. All it says is, I admit it may be perfect, but it has limitations. Whether those limitations are it can't reach everybody, or limitations are that it has flaws, etc. So in my pluralism, I came to realize that there are lots of things I can learn and lots of limitations in my own system, and I try to listen. And whenever I could, I try to incorporate the criticism or the disagreement. Can I account for it? Can I modify it? Can I improve it? My own thinking. So I think that's been a big help, and I was lucky enough, again, partly my field is history ideas. I was exposed to a very wide range of ideas, and I've tried psychologically and intellectually to account for them as much as I can. So I think one of the things that characterizes the book and my thinking in general is a very wide range of alternative and nuanced and aspects of thought. So I think that plays a role in its relevance, particularly since I say the time we're living in. We're living in a time, and I'm saying, in the past you could hear monophonically. You can't hear monophonically anymore. You can create a ghetto, you can go to Bnei Brak and make sure they don't publish or show pictures of women and so on. You can create an artificial environment where you only hear your own voice. And one of the dangers of the internet, I'm told, is that it's the same thing, that people stop listening to all the alternatives. They only hear something completely confirms what they're saying, at least the polarization. So that's a choice. But most people, I think, consciously or unconsciously, they're exposed to this incredible range. And I think the more you range exposed to, the more you incorporate meaningfully, obviously, the more richer, the more credible, the more livable is your philosophy. That was, so on one foot, that would be my answer to your question. And of course, I have the other advantage, I'm interpreting Judaism, so the raw material I'm interpreting, I think, has a lot of richness, variety, and depth, and so it helps the medicine go down. The third question was?
The voltage in the Orthodox.
Oh, voltage. This is one of the sad, I went to a yeshiva, that's why I got smicha. By luck, I went to modern Orthodox schools most of my life. I stumbled into this yeshiva. There was an offshoot of the Musar movement of the 19th century. In the 19th century, Rabbi Israel Salanter, in fact, a student of mine and I together translated one of his only existing major work, just published recently also, and it's worth looking at.
It's an amazing book, Or Yisrael.
What drove Salanter was, he saw modernity was coming. He saw it was coming, and he realized what I'm talking about, that the monopoly was about to disintegrate. So orthodoxy, Haredi orthodoxy, it was self-evident, and it was overwhelmingly concentrated, so you could get away with that. But he saw a world of alternative viewpoints and counter forces, and different influences were coming. So Salanter tried very hard to develop a new understanding of a tradition. The two main points. One was, instead of being conformist and behavioral, you have to make it internal. Because behavioral and conformist works when everybody else is doing the same thing. But the minute you go into a world in which all the other viewpoints are being practiced, it disintegrates. So the only way it can stand in the presence of the other is to internalize it and to develop much more of a sense of purpose and values, and not just simply the externals of the act. He tried very hard for that, and I still think, because the reality was, for the most part, he didn't succeed. Namely, to this day, many traditions, including Orthodoxy, mostly get themselves across by presenting one way and by training and indoctrinating and sheltering against the alternative viewpoints. So it's a problem, but the price you pay for that is a result, is that sometimes the religion is so busy protecting it that it ends up doing not what God wants, but what's needed to stay protected. And therefore, I think this is the sad truth. And of course, same thing happened with Zionism. When Zionism started, the Haredim, overwhelmingly to this day, fought Zionism. Why? Because they thought that human action and human initiative is going to undermine God's work. Sorry, but if you think about what that means, in the end, it means that that the religious were acting against what God wants, and they argue this in the book. God wants humans. This is our age, and this is our time. The modern period for humanity and the post-Shoah period for Jews is the period when you take power for the sake of life. After the Shoah, we understood if you don't take power, evil wins. If you're powerless, it has no limit, it can wipe you out. So the whole world, not just Jews, women, gays, African Americans, colonial people, got the same message: take power and make a better world. And protect yourself. You can't protect yourself unless you have power itself. Now again, I'm adding, if you take power for yourself, you have to be bound by the traditional, by ethics, not to abuse that power. So my tragedy and my sad story in response to your question is, in my judgment, the most traditional community, out of protection or desire to protect God and their own way of living, misses some of the most fundamental religious views, values, and practices of the Jewish religion. And just as they missed Zionism, in many cases I think they're missing the image of God and the implications, whether it be for women or for men or for Gentiles. So it's very sad. I feel very sad for them, particularly since the intentions are good and the desire is good. But that's the penalty, and to me that inspires me to work harder to try to understand not what I'm comfortable or what I'm safe or what I'm convinced is correct, but what would God want? What would God want me to do? And of course, if you have to watch that can turn into something.
That can be very dangerous. So, Rabbi Yitz, we have 5 minutes.
The last question was yours.
It was my question.
What was the last question? I was dodging it. What was the last question?
I just want us to leave with you living in Israel now. You've been living there for a while, and it's dangerous there. It's a year like no other. And your book is about the triumph of life. And obviously, for those who know Israel, know that, notwithstanding the absolute terror that it experienced on October 7th, there's been a great triumph in many ways in various sectors. But just wondering, in one foot with 4 minutes left, what's your hope right now for where Israel is? And just give us a sense of what you're thinking about Israel right now. And
yes,
Arna?
Yes, and leave me 40 seconds for an epilogue final question to Rabbi Yitz after your final question.
I'll try to make it a little shorter. Well, put it bluntly, everybody says October 7th was the worst day of Jewish killing and massacres since the Holocaust. So many people evoke the Holocaust in dealing with the October 7th. I'll invoke it in this way. If one has lived through and absorbed the idea that killing 6 million, so in a paradoxical sort of way, you're not totally destroyed by discovering that they can kill another 1,200 or Jews and abduct so on and so on. In other words, as shocking as it isn't the worst thing that ever happened to Jewish people. And part of my response is the conviction. Sometimes I think the devil must be depressed. After you pull off the Shoah, you kill 6 million, you torture, you do all the things. And the Jews, instead of collapsing and walking away from Judaism, come back with deeper faith, deeper commitment, and create the state of Israel, which is the greatest outburst of life in Jewish history. So I say, what do you do for an encore as a murderer, as a devil? Maybe the devil is feeling depressed. I'll never win. And I do believe that. So my first answer is, I think if you look at the Jewish record, you will find that after the worst tragedies, they came back, and they came back in greater spirit. So I now understand, and that's how I argue that in the book, that God has given freedom, therefore there's no guarantee anymore. Once there's freedom, the humans may misuse that freedom. I am very nervous, the present government of Israel. I have very little trust and respect for the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, who I think is politically driven for his personal interest and endangering the State of Israel, and so on. And the extremists in that government make me shudder. So I have no guarantees in this business. But my basic reaction, number one, if you trust the past record, the Jewish people will come back from tragedy, setback, disaster, and prove, or at least establish, what the Torah claims all along, that life, in fact, is stronger than death, and that's why it's going to win out in the end with God's help. That's the main reaction I have. Secondly, I have to say that it's a very difficult time now because the death comes very close. The week before we left, one of the beloved teachers of our grandson, who lives in the house with us, was killed in battle. And 2 days later, our neighbor, 50 yards away, his son was killed, father of 4 and reservist, was killed in battle. And it gets very close, and it's very devastating, and it's very hard. So now, why am I nevertheless an optimist? The answer is we went to many shivas and talked with many parents. And the key question is very clearly answered already. Overwhelmingly, the parents said, I understand now clearer after October 7th that the right to exist and live in Israel is not guaranteed and not accepted by much of the world. That means the price of living here and staying here and believing this is the right place to be is that my children or my grandchildren, like that Cato, they'll be bound to the altar and they may or may not, lives may or may not be taken. But I'm ready to do that. And again, it's overwhelming and amazing, Israel. The young generation, they're not running away. They're volunteering, they're coming forward, they're asking to be, the application for Kravi, for the battle fighting units. I mean, we have 3 grandchildren in the army, but they're in intelligence. They're not, one of us in the Air Force. They're much less exposed to the danger of an individual being killed. But thousands of young Israelis stepped up and said, I want to apply for Kravi. I understand the risk, but I understand that without this, the Jewish state cannot exist. So my answer is, I believe this is a reason to be optimistic, and that if we fight this through and work this through, we'll come back even stronger than ever. And I remind you, by stronger than ever means Israel is a world leader in so many positive areas. So that's my basic hope. And in the meantime, you have to live in, there's no shortcuts. And do I have anxiety about the government? Yes. And I hope there'll be a change. Yes. But in the meantime, you can only do what you have in the best way you can.
Arna, go ahead.
This will be very quick. I want to end, if we can, on the micro, and not the communal, but the personal. And just share with all of you that about 6 months ago, I had the privilege of sitting with Blue in your apartment in Jerusalem and interview Blue. The extraordinary history of Jewish feminism really began in that 3rd row from the back there. Yes, thank you. And what I thought I went into with the interview and the purpose, and this was shared and witnessed by those rabbis and educators that came to study with Rabbi Yitz, was not what I came out with. What I came in with is to understand Blue's contributions to feminism, and we did that. But what we all walked away from coming out of that apartment, Rabbi Yitz and Blue, is that this is a love affair. This is a love between 2 people that is so rare. We all left feeling deeply shamed by our own relationships. But it occurred to me.
You should only know the truth.
No, I saw the truth. You know, I just had this major epiphany. that Robert Alter, the biblical scholar from Berkeley, talks about the biblical characters. He says they are a microcosm of the civilization which they're living. So, for instance, the biblical personalities in the book of Judges are nasty because it's a nasty and difficult time. Rav Yitz, if I may, Triumph of Life can be written because of the love that you have. I mean, your vision of the world stems, it seems to me, from this. That's not a question. It's an observation shared with love and respect. But thank you for the love that you have for each other, and therefore this extraordinary work that you've brought to the world.
Incredible. So, thank you to Arna Popko, and thank you to Rabbi Yitz Greenberg.